Jean Seberg, a small-town Iowa girl chosen at just 17 to be Hollywood's next golden child. She was beautiful, blonde, and seemingly destined for stardom, but behind the wide eyes and camera flashes, Jean would become the target of one of the most disturbing FBI smear campaigns in history. By the late 1960s, Jean wasn't just an actress. She was political, defiant. She gave her money, her voice, and her loyalty to causes the U.S. government wanted destroyed. That's when head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, personally opened a file on her, and he said she had to be neutralized. From that moment, her life changed. Her phones were tapped, salacious rumors were planted, and a smear campaign designed to be so cruel that it cost her the life of her child. From that moment, Jean was never the same. And if that wasn't bad enough, the very same groups that she tried to ally with didn't trust her either. Being seen as an informant or snitch, not only was Jean being watched by federal agents, she was being monitored by the Black Panthers too. By then, it was all too much, and for Jean, she began to lose her mind, literally. Her fame turned to exile. Her confidence turned to paranoia. And every time she looked over her shoulder, someone really was there. In 1979, her body was found decomposing in the back seat of her car in Paris after being missing for 10 days. Officially, it was called a suicide, but it's questionable and reeks of possible foul play. The way she died, the gaps in the timeline, the inconsistencies in the evidence, a lot of it doesn't add up. But after years of government surveillance and purposeful image destruction, raises a chilling question. Was Jean Seberg destroyed by her own despair, or was she finally silenced by the system that had already marked her for death? This documentary is based on declassified government files, public records, and widely reported historical events. It also references allegations and interpretations that remain disputed or unproven. All information is presented for educational and editorial purposes, under fair use. Some scenes have been recreated for context. What you're about to see is a mix of verified history and the unanswered questions that still surround it. Viewer discretion is advised. She was blonde, beautiful, and dead at 40. But this isn't a story about Hollywood glamour. This is a story about what happens when you give your heart to a cause the system already hates, and what happens when caring too much makes you the enemy. Jean Seberg was once America's perceived innocent sweetheart, a small-town girl from Marshalltown, Iowa, who got plucked from obscurity at just 17. No acting experience, no Hollywood family, just a fresh face and a dangerous amount of ambition. Jean was always a spirited child who leaned toward humanitarian efforts and civil rights causes from early on. At just 14 years old, she joined the NAACP, an unusual move for a small-town white teenager in Iowa in the early 1950s. To her family, this wasn't just surprising, it was troubling. They felt she was stepping into territory that was too radical. Her father even warned her, "People are going to think you're a communist." And in that era, being branded a communist was one of the worst labels you could carry. This was the height of the Cold War. Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee were blacklisting actors, musicians, and anyone accused of having ties to communism. To be called a communist meant you were anti-American, disloyal, maybe even a traitor. Careers were destroyed, lives were ruined. It was a scarlet letter that could follow you forever. But Jean didn't care. Even as a teenager, she seemed to understand something her peers didn't, that taking a stand for justice would always come with a price, and she seemed willing to pay it. According to Jean's own words, her desire to help came from a deep sense of alienation. She grew up in a strict household where she often felt isolated and misunderstood, and she reasoned if she, a small-town white girl, could feel that level of loneliness and alienation, then people who were marginalized in far greater ways must feel it even more profoundly. But even though Jean was hell-bent on helping others, she didn't allow that to interfere with her personal dreams and ambitions. Jean wanted to be a professional actress, a dream her family wasn't exactly thrilled about. But she was headstrong, determined, and nothing was going to stop her. Around that time, famous film director Otto Preminger announced a nationwide search for the lead in his upcoming movie about Joan of Arc. Jean's neighbor secretly submitted her photo for the contest. Against all odds, she won, beating out more than 18,000 other hopefuls. The catch? Jean had zero acting experience, and her very first role would be as Joan of Arc in Saint Joan, the story of a French girl burned alive for refusing to obey men in power. It was supposed to be her big break. But instead, Hollywood burned her. Literally. Preminger, known for being cruel to his actors, pushed Jean beyond limits. During reshoots, he forced her into a real fire pit over and over until she was actually set on fire. She walked away with severe, permanent burns on her hands and stomach, scarred physically, scarred emotionally, on her very first film. And in the end, it was all for nothing. The press turned on her. Critics called her wooden, a flop. Preminger publicly humiliated her in interviews, and just like that, the next big thing was written off as a joke. It was almost as if she'd been set up to fail from the very beginning. A cruel preview of what was waiting for her later in life. Powerful men building her up only to tear her down. The fire that scarred her on set was only the first. Years later, a different kind of fire, one fueled by rumors, headlines, and government files, would burn through her reputation until there was nothing left but ashes. But Jean didn't disappear. She ran to Europe, France, specifically, where she reinvented herself as the darling of the French New Wave. She chopped off her hair, became a style icon, learned the language, and started living life on her own terms. Paris loved her. America had moved on, but something was shifting inside her. Behind the eyes of that soft-spoken girl was a growing storm. She had seen the cruelty of the industry, the way fame chewed people up, the way directors abused young girls and called it art. And as the 60s rolled in, so did many radical movements. There was chaos all over the nation. Protests, racial injustices, and lynchings. These things troubled Jean greatly, and she couldn't look away. She made a choice to stand with the oppressed, to use her fame as a weapon. And just as she had once joined the NAACP as a teenager, she would throw herself into the fight again. Only this time, the cost would be far greater. In order to understand what happened to Jean Seberg, you have to understand COINTELPRO, a secret FBI program that operated for over 15 years, targeting American citizens the government viewed as threats. COINTELPRO stands for Counterintelligence Program. It was launched in 1956 under the direction of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The original purpose was to infiltrate and undermine communist organizations during the Cold War. But as the political landscape changed, so did the mission. By the 1960s, COINTELPRO had expanded to include civil rights groups, anti-war protesters, student activists, feminist organizations, and black liberation movements. The FBI wasn't just gathering intelligence. They were actively interfering, disrupting, and destroying organizations from the inside. One of COINTELPRO's main targets was the Black Panther Party. The Panthers were a revolutionary black nationalist group that focused on self-defense, political education, and community programs, including free breakfast for children, healthcare clinics, and anti-police brutality patrols. Despite these community efforts, the FBI labeled the Panthers a domestic threat, and Hoover himself described them as the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. The Bureau's goal was simple: neutralize the Black Panther Party. This meant planting undercover agents to create distrust, forging letters between leaders to fuel internal conflict, spreading false rumors to the press, getting employers to fire members, and in some cases, encouraging violence between groups or individuals. These were not isolated incidents. They were coordinated attacks, authorized at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. and Jean would discover this firsthand. While Hollywood was chasing Oscars, Jean Seberg was chasing something else: justice. What she did next would put her name in the same government files as Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Black Panthers. Why? Because in a decade filled with war, riots, and assassinations, Jean didn't stay silent. She picked a side. And in America, choosing the perceived wrong side could cost you everything, even your life. In April of 1968, Jean was filming a movie in Washington, D.C. During production, news broke that Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. Immediately, the city exploded. Riots spread through the Capitol, businesses burned, and the film crew was forced to shut down and flee to another city. But the images Jean saw never left her: the rage, the grief, the people filling the streets, risking arrest, or worse, for their freedoms. She knew then that she had to step in, so she began quietly donating money to civil rights causes. She supported Native American activists. She sent funds to struggling Black families. She wrote letters to political prisoners. And she wasn't shy about her opposition to the Vietnam War, even if it made her unpopular in Hollywood. But it was when she crossed paths with one of the most radical men she had ever met that her life would change forever. It was on what felt like a predestined flight to Los Angeles that Jean Seberg found herself seated next to a man who would change the trajectory of her life, Hakeem Abdullah Jamal. And Hakeem wasn't just anyone. He was a Black nationalist, an author, a self-proclaimed part-time Panther, and the cousin of none other than Malcolm X. During the flight, Hakeem, who struck Jean as arrogant and self-important, spoke at length about himself. He talked about his criminal past, his previous substance abuse addiction, his time in prison. He even spoke about how he tried to murder 2 people in the past, and then his ultimate transformation into a revolutionary. He told her he was fighting for the freedom and dignity of Black Americans, that he was trying to carry the torch Malcolm had left behind. Jean was intrigued, but she was also cautious. To her, Hakeem seemed like the kind of man who knew how to weaponize charisma, a seductive manipulator who understood exactly how to tap into white guilt and idealism. And yet still, she was drawn in. When she asked how she could help, he told her about a school he was building, a progressive institution modeled after the Montessori method, designed to empower Black children with freedom-based education, critical thinking, and pride in their identity. And just like that, Jean got involved. And this is when things went from compassion to passion to destruction. Almost immediately, she began writing checks to Hakeem Jamal for his projects. Although Hakeem wasn't a formal member of the Black Panther Party, he opened the door for her, introducing Jean to Bobby Seale and other Panther leaders. Seale's vision for the free breakfast program for children captivated her, and she poured money into it. She also contributed to the Panthers' planned health clinic, paid hospital bills for poor Black families, and even covered delivery costs for mothers who couldn't afford them. Jean went even further. She allowed her Coldwater Canyon home to become a headquarters for the party, hosting celebrity fundraisers and lending her vehicles to ferry members between airports, rallies, and events. Sometimes she personally chauffeured and chaperoned them. But Jean didn't realize her generosity had drawn the wrong kind of attention. The Panthers were already under heavy FBI surveillance. To J. Edgar Hoover, the sight of a lily-white Hollywood actress financing and housing a group the Bureau had labeled a domestic threat was intolerable. The moment her name came up in connection to the Panthers, Hoover told the FBI to open a file on her immediately. He said she needs to be neutralized, and he didn't stop there. He had an agent assigned to watch her movements, her calls, her mail. She was officially under COINTELPRO surveillance. An agent was immediately assigned to watch her, tapping her phones, stealing her mail, snapping pictures of her whereabouts and colleagues, and capturing all her bank statements. They stalked her every move. And the agents weren't the only ones watching. Inside the movement itself, suspicions rose. Some Black Panther members quietly questioned why this wealthy white actress was so eager to help them. Was she a genuine ally or a government plant? They didn't know that Jean herself was being monitored just as they were, but her presence was skeptical. And it wasn't only the Panthers who were wary. Members of SNCC became hostile when Hakeem brought Jean to their meetings. They openly asked why a white woman was present and why a Black man claiming Black leadership was being seen with her alone. To them, it didn't look right. It looked hypocritical and sketchy, and their suspicions weren't entirely off base. Because while Jean was funding community programs and attending political meetings, she and Hakeem were also slipping into a secret obsessive affair. They'd become intimate, but problem is, Hakeem was married. His wife, Dorothy Jamal, was at home raising their 6 children. Jean had even helped Dorothy, a detail that makes her betrayal sting. And there was another problem. Jean herself was also married. She was currently still married to her second husband, French novelist and director Romain Gary, who was 25 years older than her, and the couple had a son. Though they were separated at the time and her son was living with Romain, Jean traveled back and forth to France, living like a free woman. Both Jean and Hakeem were already tied to families, but did that stop them? No. According to her FBI files and the phones calls and letters that were exchanged, it showed that Jean and Hakeem were serious, and they didn't really care who knew about them, including Hakeem's wife, Dorothy. The FBI was even cruel enough to send in recordings of Hakeem and Jean being intimate for Dorothy to hear, something that J. Edgar Hoover also did to Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King Jr. This caused Dorothy to call Jean's father and ask him to get his daughter to leave her husband alone. According to the files, Dorothy was also making plans to sue Jean for her affair. Ironically, Jean wasn't the only high-profile white woman that Hakeem was having an affair with. He was with British novelist Diana Athill and model and socialite Gail Benson, who also had a passion for the Black liberation movement. Hakeem was using all these women to fund his revolutionary endeavors, as well as using some of them as his white female slaves in a sick, twisted form of reparations, something that made Jean question his seriousness. In a recorded phone call to another Black Panther member, Jean confessed that she believes that Huey P. Newton knew that Hakeem wasn't serious about the revolution, didn't really fit in, and wasn't really what a Black Panther was about. That Huey had gotten rid of him, which caused Hakeem to go back to leading his Malcolm X Foundation. But Jean had no room to be upset with Hakeem about his affairs because she was having many of her own. When she felt she could no longer deal with his wife's threats, his huge God-complex ego, and his possessiveness, she started to have an affair with fellow Black Panther Raymond Marseille Hewitt, who was also married. This was causing issues too. According to her FBI files, they spotted Raymond sneaking to her home, and when they caught him, he was in his boxers yelling at her. He was angry because he felt she was spending too much time and giving all her love and attention to Hakeem. He even threatened that if she didn't leave him alone, he was going to make Hakeem a wanted man. And this was after Hakeem had sternly let Raymond know that he didn't share his women and that Jean was his. So yes, both Hakeem and Jean had families. But did that stop them? Not at all. The affair became intense, secret, obsessive. Hakeem saw Jean as a symbol, a blonde Hollywood actress who didn't just talk, she gave. She showed up, she paid for the revolution. And Jean, she saw Hakeem as a way to truly be useful and indulge her humanitarian efforts. Through Hakeem, she was introduced even deeper into the Black Panther Party, a group the government had already labeled a national threat. But she didn't back down. She donated thousands, sat in rooms where sometimes she was the only white person, made herself visible. She didn't hide it, and that was her mistake, because while she was trying to help the movement, She became part of the target not just for the FBI, but for the people she thought she was helping too. In one internal FBI memo, dated April 1969, agents discussed the need to cause Jean Seberg embarrassment and serve to cheapen her image with the public. Why? Because she had donated money upwards of $10,500 to the Black Panther Party, the equivalent of $93,000 in 2025, helped fund their schools and programs, and was romantically tied to known black radicals. And in the next year, the FBI would get their perfect chance. By late 1969, Jean Seberg was breaking. In interviews, she started rambling. Her eyes darted. Her voice trembled. She claimed people were watching her, tapping her phones, bugging her apartment, and they were. Her FBI file shows extensive surveillance. Cars parked outside her building. Agents tracking her movements. Phones monitored reports filed on her every political donation, friend, or lover. Her movie producers spoke of how she'd call frantically in the middle of the night, complaining of hearing clicks in her phones. She'd change hotels spontaneously and constantly. She was sincerely losing it. But it wasn't just the FBI. Some members of the Black Panther Party, already torn apart by infiltration, just couldn't trust Jean even though they took her donations. They whispered that she just might be a CIA plant using her fame as cover. They didn't believe any white woman would give them money just because. Some also noted that she was too eager, too desperate to prove herself. One former associate claimed the Panthers even threatened her, warning her to back off when she kept trying to insert herself into Panther business. She thought she was helping, but some of them thought she was spying, and the more she tried to prove her loyalty, the more unstable she looked. Jean became obsessed with proving her innocence and her usefulness. She wrote frantic letters, made dramatic phone calls to journalists, tried to connect with old Panther allies who no longer returned her calls. She was alone, surrounded by shadows on all sides. Her friends began describing her as nervous, erratic, chain-smoking, and always looking over her shoulder. By early 1970, Jean became pregnant. What was supposed to be a private and joyous occasion quickly would turn into a devastating turn of events, filled with chaos, drama, and death. Jean was still being surveilled and her phone calls were still being tapped. And it was during one of these wired phone calls that the FBI overheard some information that would give them the fuel to set the fire. The FBI heard Jean tell Raymond Marcy Hewitt that she believed that the baby was his. Without waiting for medical confirmation or even basic accuracy, within days the Bureau agents wrote up an internal request to circulate the information to the press. Posing as a concerned fan, the FBI sent a forged letter to Los Angeles Times gossip columnist Joyce Haber, claiming Jean Seberg was pregnant by a Black Panther. From there, the claim jumped to Newsweek, turning a private pregnancy into a public scandal and setting the stage for Jean's unraveling. After the Newsweek article came out, Jean tried to call Raymond to let him know they were being put on blast and how bad it was going to make her look. But instead of him, his wife picked up. Jean stayed on the phone and started talking. In that tapped conversation, Jean revealed that she was having complications with her pregnancy. She said the stress from the article, the surveillance, and all the headlines was starting to take a serious toll. Her doctors were worried the baby might come early, and if it did, it might not survive. Now keep in mind, Raymond's wife was also pregnant at the time. So it was messy, to say the least. You had a woman accused of being pregnant by another woman's husband, talking to that very wife about her pregnancy problems. And throughout the call, Jean kept repeating that she didn't want to be seen as someone causing dissension within the party. But in a lot of ways, she was. Because once the conversation shifted, Jean started speaking negatively about fellow Panther members, primarily her former lover, Hakeem Jamal. She called him arrogant, unstable, said his hatred of white people came back after she cut him off. She told the wife that Hakeem had written her a letter accusing her of being an informant, an agent, and a spy, that he said she was using the party for her own gain. But Jean claimed it was just revenge, said Hakeem was a hypocrite, and pointed out that even Huey Newton knew Hakeem lacked discipline, which was part of why Huey booted him out of the party in the first place. Jean said she still planned to keep donating to the Panthers, especially after she finished suing Newsweek, but she also made it clear if the party turned on her, she'd be willing to expose them too. So, yes, threatening to air out the very group you'd aligned yourself with while sleeping with their members' husbands was definitely causing dissension, whether she meant to or not, and Jean knew it. Before hanging up, she told the wife to have Raymond call her back. She stayed calm, took down the message, and passed it on. Raymond eventually returned Jean's call. And once again, the FBI was listening. Jean told him she'd seen the Newsweek article and it was bad, not just because of the headline, but because of what it meant. She was already being painted as a joke, a liability, a white woman who couldn't keep her legs closed, and the worst part, it wasn't just the press. Raymond told her that Hakeem Jamal was writing a book, one he was calling Sugar-Coated Bullet, and yes, it was about them, about the movement, about everything. While Raymond didn't sound surprised, Jean sounded tense. Then she dropped another layer. Her estranged husband, Romain Gary, was also working on a book, one that would explore the Black Power movement from a sympathetic point of view, but one that would still include the good, the bad, and her involvement. That made 3 attacks from 3 different angles. Newsweek with the public smear Hakeem, with the insider betrayal and Romain, with the intellectual exposure. Jean wasn't just worried, she was overwhelmed. Her baby was already at risk, her reputation was falling apart, and now she was about to be written about by the 2 men who knew her the most intimately, and possibly the most bitterly. Jean had always worried about being seen as the cause of dissension, but by this point, it wasn't just perception. Her relationships were actually starting to fracture the movement. Her affair with Raymond Hewitt and her past with Hakeem Jamal created real tension inside the party. And now that her name was tied to both men, and that both men were tied to her body, it was only a matter of time before things exploded, and they did. These weren't just personal arguments. This was public drama spilling into a political movement, and Jean was right at the center of it. Whether she meant to or not, her personal life was becoming a liability, not just for herself, but for the men around her, and for the movement they were all supposed to be fighting for. And this was all great fodder for the FBI to use against Jean's character, because it only got messier. Because even with all the surveillance, one thing stayed unclear: who actually fathered her baby? Because she had told Raymond she believed it was his. Her estranged husband would assume responsibility for the baby. But years later, Jean reportedly admitted that the baby wasn't Ray's or Romain's, and it wasn't Hakeem's either. The father, she claimed, was actually Carlos Navarra, a Mexican revolutionary student she met while filming a movie in Mexico. The FBI had tracked her movements while in Mexico and saw that she had quickly begun a sexual affair with Carlos after getting involved in his movement. She helped fund their cause during the protests, and like she often did with the men she connected to politically, things turned romantic, intimate, and soon after, she became pregnant. But again, Carlos wasn't the only man in her life during that time. Jean had a pattern, one that stretched back years. While married to her first husband, she had an affair with Clint Eastwood, who was married at the time. She later got involved with Warren Beatty, Sammy Davis Jr., and her co-star Lee Marvin, and many other actors, directors, and men in the industry. It wasn't just that she was unfaithful, it was that she was messy, sleeping with multiple men at once, rarely using protection, telling different men different versions of the truth, and constantly moving in and out of relationships that blurred political loyalty with sexual access. The FBI didn't have to lie about her. They didn't even have to exaggerate. They just had to write down what they heard. And this caused them to label her a sexual pervert and promiscuous, which was making everything easier to destroy her. The pressure on Jean wasn't just emotional, it became physical, and it turned fatal. By the time the Newsweek article dropped, Jean was already under stress from every direction: FBI surveillance, constant media attention, tension with her lovers, and uncertainty about her child's father. She couldn't sleep. The paranoia from the stalking and distrust from every direction was driving her insane. Jean had overdosed on sleeping pills and had to be rushed to the hospital. Her doctors had already warned her that the baby was at risk. The stress levels were too high. Her pregnancy was becoming unstable. They were right. August 23, 1970, Jean went into premature labor. The doctors did all they could to keep the baby inside, but it was ineffective. At only 4 pounds, her baby, a little girl she named Nina Hart Gary, was born too early to survive, and just 2 days after birth, baby Nina died. Jean was devastated. She went into a deep depression. Her response showed just how deeply the smear campaign had cut her. At her baby's funeral, she invited a reporter to view the body, hoping to prove, once and for all, that the child was white, not Raymond Hewitt's. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim her image and undo the lie the FBI had seeded, but the press didn't care. The original headlines about a white actress carrying a Black Panthers child had been front-page gossip. When Jean publicly disproved it, the story barely made a peep. The correction was whispered, the smear had already stuck. Now Jean was left with a dead child, a ruined reputation, and a public that had moved on. For the FBI, the operation was considered a success. For Jean, it was a devastation she would never recover from. By the mid-1970s, Jean Seberg's world had collapsed. She'd cut her ties to the Panthers, distancing herself from the movement that had brought so much trouble to her life. Even though he took responsibility for her deceased baby girl, Jean finally divorced Romaine Gary and got remarried to director Dennis Barry. Her attempt to clear her name in court also went nowhere. Jean and her husband filed a libel and defamation suit against Newsweek, asking for $200,000 in damages. She argued that the article had devastated her so much that she went into premature labor, causing the death of her daughter. The Paris court agreed the article was defamatory, but awarded the couple only $10,800. Newsweek was ordered to publish the judgment in its pages and in 8 other newspapers. It was a legal win on paper, but a public loss. The payout was small, and the correction barely noticed. The damage was already done. By now, the movement that she had been a major part of was crumbling as well. The Black Panther Party was being dismantled one by one, division by division. There were multiple unfounded arrests, major infiltrations that caused fraction and infighting within the group, and there were multiple assassinations of prominent figures. One of those assassinations was Jean's former lover, Hakeem Jamal. In 1973, Hakeem Jamal was assassinated in Boston, supposedly from the same members who murdered Malcolm X. Hakeem had allegedly spoken against Elijah Muhammad, and therefore men were sent to get rid of him. And only a year prior was Hakeem's other girlfriend, Gail Benson, also suspiciously murdered by Hakeem's associates. This is what I mean by there was so much infighting and distrust within these groups now. And their deaths made headlines, and once again Jean's name surfaced in connection with Panthers, sex, and violence. Her reputation never recovered. The white actress who had once been photographed at protests in praise for her bravery was now treated as a cautionary tale, reckless, unstable, and tainted. The FBI's smear campaign had succeeded. She was still being watched, but now she had no movement backing her and no allies left in Hollywood. Her mental health began to slide. The loss of her daughter haunted her, so much so that the annual anniversary of her death became a trigger for suicide attempts. She was living in Paris, still isolated and suspicious. Even though she was far from Los Angeles, The surveillance files show she was still a name in bureau memos and still monitored. By 1973, Jean was desperate for something steady, love, stability, anything to pull her out of the spiral. Her marriage to Dennis Barry was already crumbling. She thought that, as a movie director, he'd be able to help her decline career, but he couldn't help her. He was struggling in his career himself. Then accusations of erratic behavior from Jean and domestic violence between both of them, as well as her continued infidelities, caused them to separate. Her career was still collapsing. Hollywood had moved on, and in Europe she was reduced to whatever scraps were offered. Instead of a comeback, she found herself in smaller and smaller roles, the kind that didn't fit a woman who had once been an international star. Money grew tight, and more than that, Jean's sense of self was slipping. At first, Jean tried to reinvent her life in Paris. Her apartment became a gathering spot for artists, dreamers, and artsy revolutionary misfits, people who lived on the edge just like she did. On the surface, it looked like she was still part of something vibrant. But inside, Jean was unraveling. Her drinking grew heavier. Her nights were spent wandering bars, chain smoking, drinking until dawn, and arguing politics with anyone who would listen. She talked about injustice, conspiracies, and enemies that never seemed to leave her mind. Her words were frantic, and her eyes carried that glazed, desperate look of someone haunted by both the past and the present. Her friends remembered her drifting between laughter and despair in the span of an evening. There was no middle ground, just ultimate extremes. One night after too much alcohol, Jean snapped. She slit her wrists in front of those around her. It wasn't the first time she had tried to leave this world, and it wouldn't be the last, but it was the clearest sign yet. Jean Seberg was living on borrowed time. By the mid-70s, Jean was no longer fighting for stardom. She was fighting for herself. Her paranoia grew worse. She began to believe she was being watched, followed, even hunted. Sometimes she was calm. Other times she would spiral into being psychotic, convinced that unseen forces were closing in on her. The following years saw her in and out of psychiatric clinics. Doctors tried to medicate the depression, to stabilize her moods, but the treatments were never enough. They dulled her, numbed her, but they couldn't erase the grief or paranoia that the FBI left behind. By the late 70s, Jean's life had drifted into open chaos. She surrounded herself with horrible people as her own addictions grew. Her once elegant Paris apartment was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a hangout for drifters, addicts, and petty criminals. The walls that once held dinner parties and art discussions now echoed with the noise of people using her home as a crash pad. She'd gone to detox programs and rehabs to try and reclaim her life. And for a brief moment, it looked like they worked. Jean came out slimmer, her hair styled, looking almost like herself again. But her closest friends saw the truth. It was only a mask. Beneath the surface, her anguish had deepened. And then came 1979. This is the year when Jean's already chaotic life would take the ultimate downturn, one that she would never be able to rectify. 1979 was the beginning of Jean's end. Firstly, she and her husband Dennis were still separated, and she began to date several men. But it was one man in particular that would help cause her imminent destruction. Ahmed Hasni, a charismatic Algerian man that Jean met while she was donating to protesters in Algeria and showing that she was still having a revolutionary spirit. Ahmed was young, much, much younger than Jean, and he started off as a liar and deceiver. He was 19 years old and told Jean he was 29, and he had a very bad reputation. He was known to prey on older wealthy women and use them for their resources, and it seemed that he'd had his eyes on Jean. And for Jean, she was at her most vulnerable. Her health was failing, her depression was as severe as ever, and she basically had no career. And on top of it all, she was very lonely. With no real support, Ahmed seemed like a rescuer. But to her family, he looked like a predator who recognized her vulnerability and moved quickly to take advantage. And Ahmed didn't just enter Jean's life, he inserted himself into every part of it. He moved into her apartment. He started answering her phone, controlling who got access to her, and making himself the filter between Jean and the outside world. Friends noticed immediately Jean wasn't reachable without going through him. Then came the money. Hasni convinced Jean to sell off one of her most valuable assets, her second Paris apartment. He told her the money would be used for a restaurant venture in Barcelona, a new future they'd share, but the venture never happened. The money disappeared, and with it, any financial cushion Jean had left. By summer, she was more isolated than ever. She drifted between Paris and Spain with Hasni, cut off from friends who once tried to intervene. Then rumors began to spread that he was abusive to Jean, that arguments between them turned violent, so much so that Jean fled to get away from him. He went searching for her everywhere, and unfortunately, she did return to Ahmed, and they reconciled, and that might have been her worst mistake. On the night of August 30th, 1979, Jean vanished. The details of those final hours come almost entirely from Ahmed Hasni's account, and his version never quite held together. He told police that he and Jean went to see a film that night, a movie called Womanlight. According to Ahmed, it was the film that had upset Jean. The supposed reason was that the movie, directed by her ex-husband, Romain Gary, was a film she believed was about her and their broken marriage. And not only did she feel exposed, she felt replaced. Ahmed claims that Jean had wanted to play the lead role herself, but another actress got the part, and that rejection stung. The film was supposed to be hers, especially if it was supposed to be about her life. She supposedly left the theater drunk, distraught, and reportedly spiraling. Afterward, he claimed, they returned home. They fell asleep together. And when he woke up, Jean was no longer there. That was his story. But for a woman as fragile as Jean, a woman so closely watched by doctors, friends, and even the press, the idea that she could simply disappear in the middle of the night without anyone noticing it didn't add up, because she'd been missing for days, and by day 9 she was found. 9 days after she vanished, the search ended. On September 8, 1979, Jean Seberg's body was found slumped in the back seat of her white Renault. The car was parked just blocks from her Paris apartment. The scene was unsettling. Her body, already decomposed, was hidden under a blanket and wrapped inside a poncho. Beside her lay a bottle of barbiturates, an empty mineral water bottle, and a folded note. The note was short, written to her son saying, "Forgive me, I can no longer live with my nerves." Police immediately declared it a suicide, but the story was neat, too neat, because the details didn't sit right. First, the car itself. For 9 days, it sat in plain view on a busy street in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, one of the wealthiest districts in the city. How does a parked car with a body inside go unnoticed for over a week? Second, the autopsy. Authorities pointed to the high levels of alcohol and barbiturates in her system as the cause. But many experts, journalists, and those close to her raised serious concerns about the physical logistics of the scene. The doubts didn't stop there. After her autopsy, crucial vials containing her toxicology samples reportedly went missing, making it impossible to fully verify the timeline or dosage of what she had taken. This disappearance raised further suspicions of evidence tampering, or worse, a deliberate cover-up. And then there's her boyfriend, Ahmed Hasni. People have suspected that he was way more involved in her demise than he let on. His actions were very odd and shady even. As already discussed, Ahmed Hasni was described by those close to Jean as a pathological liar with a violent temper and abusive behavior toward Jean. On top of that, he robbed her and ultimately stole more than 11 million French francs, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars, likely the entire value of her Paris apartment. Her son filed a legal suit against Hasni after her death, but the police reports reportedly disappeared. Just like the autopsy vials, documentation crucial to understanding what really happened was suddenly missing. Then there's his behavior the night she vanished. Third, Hosny's account. He told police Jean had been suicidal for months, that she'd even attempted to end her life weeks earlier by jumping in front of a train. Yet he also claimed he thought nothing of her sudden disappearance that night and never explained why he didn't alert anyone sooner when she failed to return. And then, the blanket. Bodies don't cover themselves. The fact that Jean's was wrapped raises questions. Was someone else there? Did someone stage the scene? To this day, he has never been formally charged in connection with her death. But still, many believe he had both motive and opportunity, financial gain, a history of abuse, and direct access to her in her final hours. And then, finally, the other death possibilities and conspiracies. By the time of her death, Jean Seberg had more than just personal demons. She had political enemies and powerful ones. As we've seen in the late 1960s and early 70s, Jean was one of the few public figures in Hollywood openly supporting civil rights, Black liberation groups, Native American activists, and political prisoners. Her donating money, using her platform to speak out, and forming personal relationships with these radical figures caused her to be targeted by COINTELPRO and the FBI. Some believe the emotional damage was the FBI's intended outcome, but others believe it went much further than that. By 1979, Jean had also become involved with other controversial movements like the Algerian independence, Palestinian causes, and global political dissidents. In each circle, she made allies and enemies. As one French journalist put it, Jean Seberg had burned bridges in every direction, from Hollywood elites who resented her politics, to foreign officials who viewed her as a liability, to local radicals who may have turned against her. The list of people who may have wanted her silenced was growing. And it's believed that any one of those factions could have come for her. So the official ruling of her death remained probable suicide. But for those who knew her story, her FBI harassment, her paranoia about being followed, the young man who drained her finances and controlled her movements, her case felt anything but simple. Jean Seberg was dead, but how and why remains a question unanswered. One person who refused to take responsibility for her death was her ex-husband, Romain Gary. After it had been stated that it was because of his movie Womanlight that caused her to die, he revealed the truth. After Jean Seberg's death was announced, Romain held a press conference in Paris to confront what he believed had really happened. Speaking to a room full of French journalists, Gary made a bold and devastating claim that Jean Seberg was destroyed by the FBI. He went further, calling her death a form of psychological murder, a long campaign of harassment and humiliation that drove her to become psychotic. And he didn't just speak from emotion, he'd brought documents. During the press conference, Gary presented excerpts from FBI files already beginning to circulate publicly, evidence that the Bureau had deliberately leaked false and damaging information about Jean to the American press. He explained how those lies led to the death of their infant daughter and how Jean had never recovered, but his claims were met with hesitation. French reporters in the room were skeptical. One even questioned whether the documents were real. At that point, no official confirmation had been made, and many viewed Gary's accusations as speculative or exaggerated. They even accused him of looking for attention and trying to remain relevant. But he stood by them. At the time, his claims seemed hard to prove, but soon documents would begin to surface. And when they did, it became clear he had been telling the truth, and soon the FBI would have to as well. At the time of Jean Seberg's death in 1979, the public still didn't know the full truth about how deeply the FBI had been involved in destroying her, but the cracks had already started to show. Back in 1971, a group of activists broke into a small FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, and leaked hundreds of classified documents to the press. That break-in exposed the secret government program, COINTELPRO, and all their dirty deeds. The leak led to national outrage, and by 1975, the U.S. Senate launched an official investigation into FBI and CIA abuses known as the Church Committee. That's when Jean Seberg's name started surfacing. Over the next few years, as pressure mounted, reporters began filing Freedom of Information Act requests to dig deeper. The Freedom of Information Act is a U.S. law that allowed journalists and citizens to request declassified government records. And after Jean's death, reporters used FOIA to request her FBI file, and what they found confirmed everything she'd been saying. The documents revealed the coordinated campaign to destroy her image, including the deliberate planting of false stories. And because these files were now public and they were getting major backlash, the FBI was forced to acknowledge their role and admit to harassing Jean. In 1979, the new FBI director, William H. Webster, issued an apology for the FBI's actions. But even after their admission, nothing was ever done to them. There were no criminal charges filed on the agents. The FBI refused to identify the specific officials who authorized and carried out the plots against Jean, and pretty soon the nation moved on, and Jean's star faded into obscurity. And if Jean's story didn't end tragically enough, one more tragedy occurred after her death. 1 year later, in 1980, Romain Gary died by suicide. In his note, he insisted his death had nothing to do with Jean, claiming instead that he simply had nothing left to write about. For many, that explanation never made sense. She tried to help. She gave her money, her platform, her safety. She lost her career, her child, her mind. Jean Seberg was a white American actress, blonde, blue-eyed, beautiful. She could have stayed quiet. She could have played the game. What makes Jean's story eerie isn't just how she died. It's how familiar it is. Because in America, people who speak out get punished. People who support the oppressed get targeted. And people who don't know their place get put in one. Jean was a warning. A white woman who tried to help black people and ultimately got treated like one. So, lurkers, what do you think? Are you familiar with Jean Seberg? Are you familiar with the FBI and their use of COINTELPRO tactics to harass people? Let me know your thoughts below.